something haunting about watching a child eat lunch alone, not because they're being bullied or excluded in any obvious way, but because they've simply learned that solitude is safer than risking rejection. They carry their tray to the corner table, pull out a book, and disappear into a world where they control the narrative, where they belong. This is the psychology of the outcast child. And if you've ever felt like you were watching life from the outside looking in, if you've ever wondered why some children seem to exist on the periphery while others effortlessly find their place in the center, then what I'm about to share will reshape everything you thought you knew about childhood development and social belonging. Because here's what most people don't understand. The outcast child isn't born different. They're made different through a complex web of psychological patterns that begin forming before they even have words to describe what's happening to them. And those patterns, once established, don't simply vanish when they turn 18. They follow them into adulthood, shaping how they view relationships, success, and their place in the world. Today we're diving deep into the hidden psychology of children who grow up on the margins. We'll explore how their minds adapt to isolation, why they develop the coping mechanisms they do, and most importantly, how understanding this psychology can unlock a different way of seeing both yourself and the world around you. But first, let me tell you what sparked my fascination with this topic. I've spent years studying developmental psychology, and I kept noticing a pattern. The most creative, insightful, and deeply empathetic adults I encountered often shared a similar childhood experience. They described feeling like observers rather than participants, like they were fluent in a language everyone else seemed to speak naturally, while they had to study every gesture, every social cue, every unwritten rule. And here's what's remarkable. Recent research in neuroscience has shown us that the brains of children who experience social isolation actually develop differently. Not damaged, but different. Their neural pathways adapt to a reality where deep observation becomes survival, where independence becomes necessity, and where inner worlds become richer than outer connections. The outcast child learns to read people the way others read books. They notice micro-expressions that slip past everyone else. They pick up on the subtle shifts in group dynamics, the unspoken hierarchies, the invisible rules that govern social interaction. This isn't because they're naturally more perceptive. It's because their survival depended on it. Think about it from an evolutionary perspective. When a child realizes they don't fit the typical social patterns, their brain doesn't shut down. It adapts. It becomes hypervigilant to social cues, because missing those cues means continued isolation. It develops rich internal worlds because external validation is scarce. It cultivates independence because relying on others feels dangerous. But here's where the psychology becomes truly complex. The adaptations that help an outcast child survive their childhood often become the very patterns that complicate their adult relationships. The hypervigilance that once protected them can become anxiety. The independence that once served them can become an inability to trust or depend on others. The rich inner world that once provided comfort can become a fortress that keeps genuine intimacy at bay. Let's talk about what actually creates an outcast child, because it's rarely what people assume. It's not always bullying, though that can certainly contribute. It's not always obvious rejection or cruelty. Sometimes it's much more subtle. Sometimes it's being the child who thinks differently, who asks questions others don't ask, who sees patterns others miss. Sometimes it's being born into a family system where emotional expression feels dangerous, where being different means being wrong. The psychology of the outcast often begins with what researchers call misattunement. This happens when a child's natural temperament, interests, or way of processing the world doesn't align with their immediate environment. Maybe they're highly sensitive in a family that values toughness. Maybe they're introspective in a culture that rewards extroversion. Maybe they're creative in an environment that prioritizes conformity. The child doesn't choose to become an outcast. They simply respond to repeated experiences of feeling misunderstood, overlooked, or fundamentally different. and their developing brain, in its remarkable adaptability, begins to wire itself for a reality where belonging happens internally rather than externally. One of the most fascinating aspects of outcast psychology is how these children develop what I call emotional archaeology. They become experts at digging beneath the surface of human behavior, at understanding the hidden motivations, fears, and desires that drive people's actions. This skill often makes them incredibly insightful friends, partners, and professionals later in life. But it also means they're constantly analysing, constantly trying to decode the world around them instead of simply experiencing it. The outcast child also develops a unique relationship with authenticity. Because they've never quite fit in naturally, they become acutely aware of the difference between genuine self-expression and performance. They can spot pretense from a mile away because they've spent so much time observing the gap between how people present themselves and who they actually are. This makes them value authenticity deeply, but it also makes them suspicious of social ease in others. Here's something that might surprise you. Many outcast children don't actually want to be popular in the traditional sense. What they crave is understanding. They want to be seen for who they truly are, not who they think others want them to be. This is why when they do form connections, those connections tend to be incredibly deep and meaningful. They're not interested in surface-level relationships because they've learned that superficial belonging feels worse than honest solitude. The psychology of the outcast is also marked by what researchers call compensatory development. When one area of social connection feels blocked, the child's development often accelerates in other areas. They might become voracious readers, talented artists, deep thinkers, or passionate about causes that others their age barely notice. It's as if the energy that other children put into social navigation gets redirected into other forms of growth and exploration. But this compensation comes with a cost. The outcast child often develops an internal critic that's particularly harsh. Because they've internalized the message that something about them doesn't quite fit, they become hyper-aware of their own flaws and differences. They might excel in areas they're passionate about while simultaneously believing they're fundamentally flawed in ways that matter most. This creates a complex psychological landscape where exceptional ability coexists with deep insecurity, where profound insight lives alongside persistent self-doubt, where the very qualities that make them unique become sources of both strength and pain. The neurological impact of growing up as an outcast extends far beyond what we see on the surface. When a child's brain is consistently activated by social stress, it begins to restructure itself in ways that prioritize threat detection over connection seeking. The amygdala, responsible for fear responses, becomes hyperactive. The prefrontal cortex, which governs social reasoning, develops differently. These aren't deficits, they're adaptations to a specific kind of environment. What's particularly striking is how this affects memory formation. Outcast children often have incredibly vivid memories of moments when they felt excluded or misunderstood, while their memories of positive social interactions may be hazier. This isn't because negative experiences happened more often, but because their brains were wired to pay closer attention to potential social threats than to moments of acceptance. This selective attention creates a feedback loop that reinforces their outsider status. When you're constantly scanning for signs of rejection, you're more likely to interpret neutral behaviors as negative. When you're hyper-aware of social dynamics, you're more likely to notice when you don't quite fit the pattern. The very psychological mechanisms that develop to protect the outcast child can end up perpetuating their isolation. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Recent longitudinal studies have revealed something remarkable about children who grow up on the social periphery. While they may struggle with traditional markers of social success during childhood and adolescence, many of them develop extraordinary resilience and creativity as adults. They become the innovators, the artists, the leaders who see possibilities others miss because they never learn to accept conventional limitations. The psychology of the outcast breeds what researchers call cognitive flexibility. Because they couldn't rely on social scripts that worked for everyone else, they learned to think outside established patterns. They developed comfort with uncertainty, with being different, with challenging assumptions that others take for granted. These are precisely the psychological traits that drive innovation and creative breakthrough. Consider how many revolutionary ideas in science, art, and social progress have come from people who describe themselves as childhood outsiders. Their ability to see from the margins gave them perspectives that those at the centre couldn't access. Their comfort with being misunderstood made them willing to pursue ideas that others might abandon at the first sign of criticism. The outcast child also develops a unique form of emotional intelligence. While they may struggle with conventional social skills, they often become exceptionally skilled at understanding human nature at a deeper level. They learn to read between the lines, to understand what people aren't saying, to recognize the fears and insecurities that drive behavior. This makes them natural counselors, writers, and leaders who can connect with others' hidden struggles. But perhaps the most significant aspect of outcast psychology is how it shapes their relationship with meaning and purpose. Because they couldn't find their worth in social approval or conventional success markers, they often develop a deeper connection to their own values and interests. They become driven by internal motivation rather than external validation. They pursue paths that feel meaningful to them rather than paths that others expect them to follow. This internal compass, forged in the isolation of childhood, often leads them to make contributions that wouldn't have been possible if they had followed more conventional routes. They become the teachers who understand struggling students, the therapists who can reach difficult clients, the entrepreneurs who solve problems others don't even recognize exist. The pain of being an outcast doesn't disappear, but it transforms. It becomes a source of empathy, of insight, of determination to create spaces where other outsiders can belong. Many outcast children grow up to build communities, create art, or develop ideas that make the world more molds. Understanding who don't fit traditional inclusive for people, this psychology is crucial because it reveals something profound about human development. The children who seem to be struggling socially may actually be developing psychological resources that will serve them extraordinarily well in adulthood. Their apparent weaknesses may be hidden strengths that won't become visible until much later. This doesn't mean we should celebrate or ignore childhood social isolation. The pain is real, and every child deserves to feel seen and valued. But it does mean we need to recognize that there are many different paths to psychological health and social contribution. The child eating lunch alone may not be broken. They may be developing capacities that our conventional understanding of childhood success fails to recognize or value. The psychology of the outcast teaches us that human development is far more complex and varied than our standard models suggest. Some of our most valuable human qualities, our deepest insights, our most meaningful contributions emerge not from fitting in perfectly, but from the psychological adaptations that develop when we learn to thrive on the margins. So if you recognize yourself in this story, if you are that child who found solace in solitude, who learned to observe from the edges, who discovered that your differences were both burden and gift, know this. Your psychology wasn't a mistake, it was an adaptation, a complex, beautiful, sometimes painful adaptation to a world that didn't quite know what to do with who you were. The hypervigilance that once felt like anxiety may have become your intuition. The independence that once felt like isolation may have become your strength. The rich inner world that once felt like escape may have become your creativity. You weren't broken then, and you're not broken now. You were simply developing differently. And perhaps most importantly, your experience matters. Not because it made you stronger, though. It may have. Not because it was meant to happen, because it wasn't. But because your perspective from the margins offers something the world desperately needs. Your ability to see what others miss, to understand what others overlook, to create what others can't imagine. The child who ate lunch alone grew up to understand that belonging isn't about fitting in. It's about finding the courage to be authentically yourself and creating spaces where others can do the same. That is the true psychology of the outcast.